Hi everyone. Today, this is Chris. Today we're going to talk about the building of the script and the story, as well as the art. So getting basically from script and idea all the way through to the final product. I'll be going pretty quickly because there's a lot of cool topics here, but if you ever want to talk about any particular topic, contact me. I'd love to chat with you about anything. We can go deep on anything you want. This is just a starter photo for the thumbnail. We'll come back to this actual image in just a minute. The first thing you do, as you could expect, is you start script development. So here's just a snapshot of the history on my script. There's a lot of it on a backup hard drive. I encourage you to get a backup hard drive anytime you're doing something like this, and always back your stuff up. But here's what the original script looked like. It was actually just a story outline. I have a friend, his name is Steve, who has a great writing class. If you're interested in learning how to do script development, he's got story arcs and teaches you how to go through basic writing all the way up to advanced techniques. But what this is the initial stuff. I actually started this back on 2020. The things down here at the bottom here, story outline. And this is now year 3. And so you can see I have things in here like, okay, Stanley was there as a snow squirrel, but I have otters in here. I have some ideas around the places that he's going to go, like the desert, the jungle, the moon, just trying to figure out what I want to do and just jotting everything down as quickly as possible. Trying to capture the essence of it. Here's different locations he could travel to. And I also have things in here like what the tradition is going to be like. And in fact, in the first version of the book, as my trial families will say, there were letters to Santa the first year around, but it just wasn't fun enough. So I even had an idea about the game mechanic that I wanted to introduce right here in the early sketches. Here's otters, where I was thinking maybe I'd use otters instead and have sketches of foxes and otters. At that point, I didn't even know what character I was going to use. And the things that would come through the wormhole were old shoes, dirty socks, half-eaten cookies, and toothpaste tubes, just because I was trying a mechanic where they were just testing the stuff out. So very early days. And then we get a little more into who's it for and some of the problems that it solves, like there's no chimneys in everyone's home. And I started just hitting some of those, basically the story beats, just capturing as much notes as I could. And that's sort of where it landed as it started. But then the script evolved over many, many iterations, and I'll just save a new iteration anytime I've done something of significance. You can see here, after my Christmas trials, even, this says 2022, but it was last Christmas, 2021, I started revising the script to make it more fun and have more lyrical techniques, alliteration, tightening up the story even more, because in the early days, the parents were saying, hey, this is too long. And if you're not aware, you can go through and get professional critiques, which I did with the Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators, and they give you feedback. You have an interview. There's lots of paid reviews you can get in addition to reading to parents and having parents give you feedback. If you're doing a children's book, I recommend you doing that. Anywho, so that's the history there. The latest version actually looks like this, because after I did all the alliteration, I also went in the book and I added colored fonts and such to help drive how someone reads the book. And so I left those in there, and I actually paid for people to read the final story. And anytime they glitched, like they stumbled over a part of a sentence, if 2 or 3 people did that, I would go in and change that sentence to make it more fluid. So this is the final version of the script that, as you see on the pages in the book, like here, they show up with the color and everything in place. So that helped with fluidity, and that's like the last round that I did on the script. Let's talk a little bit about the character development. So Stanley started out, as I said, there's a bunch of different character sketches, but he ended up being in these little character sketches I'll show you here. This is the final sketch of his body, different body positions. When you're working with artists, you have to tell them sort of what you're thinking, and so oftentimes when you illustrate a little character, sorry for that, I meant to just zoom in on there we go. You can see here the number of heads tall on the right. You may not be able to see my mouse, but I'm sort of on the right-hand side. So, character, he's 4 heads tall, his arms are a certain length, and the tail, and the initial artist drew him way too tall that I hired, and I had her shorten it. And so that's how you kind of zone in on what the height should be to be sure that your character is consistently represented in the book. Actually, I may have drawn that one and just practiced it myself. Okay, so then there's like, what does the head look like? And different angles. And you can see here there were some challenges where I actually do think I had my artist practice sketching his head, and it didn't come out right, so I gave her some feedback. Hands, feet, how are they lively, how they work, and that gives you an idea of how the artist can handle your work, and it also gets them to know your character really well. I did all the illustrations, but she did inks and colors, watercolors. But having her go through and actually ink and watercolor the pencil sketches for the character development was really helpful for her to understand what I was looking for too, and get away from some of the things that don't quite make sense, which is little freaky eye alignments and that kind of stuff that can really be disturbing when you're reading a book. So that's the beginning of the character development and the beginning of my relationship with my artist. I want to get into the thumbnails a little bit because that's where it really gets interesting for me. So whether you're in film, you're drawing comic books, or in this case children's books, as a writer illustrator, or if you're working as a writer with an illustrator, you guys can use thumbnails to quickly get the story ironed out. And here's one where I was initially having Stanley come upon a little girl who was praying. She had a missing letter from Santa that didn't get to Santa, and Stanley's story was about getting that letter to Santa. And so I got a lot of feedback during that in the first year, and he was actually telling Santa about the missing letter. And that's how I developed the first version of the book. And I had it where she was actually trying to get a gift for her brother who was sick and in the hospital. And so it changed a lot, and it evolved. But you can see this process here allows you quickly to go through and test stuff out. And here's some early sketches of him just in different situations. I was just playing with ideas at that point. But it gave me a sense of what the world could be like as I was developing the character. Okay, so the next step is actually pencils. And this is an example of a final pencil that I did of what's eventually the Nanopus image in the book. And those pencils are just the first step. They don't, unless you leave your book that way, which you can. There's a lot more work to getting from pencils to a fully colored page. I'll show you some of the other ones here to give you an idea. There's one from the Mars page, and those are rough because I could trust my inker, but I had some pretty tight ones too. In the first version of the book, Stanley actually jumps onto the sleigh and catches Santa in time and goes with Santa delivering gifts. But I changed that. Also, the initial version of the story has the wormhole sucking Stanley into it instead of him making the choice to jump. And he makes his choice to accept the journey that he goes on in a different spot in that version of the book. So those are just some of those pencils. But that changes. And here's the actual initial version of the elf that I had drawn that turns into the redhead that's actually in the book. I changed her a little bit as well. Early versions of cover design. But these are basically pencils. And there's a good example. You see how rough this is. I was trying to figure out how to get a cover with half of Stanley on one side of the cover and the other half on the other side of the cover. And I have some other designs too. But this is an early thumbnail sketch of that. And then it turned into this pencil sketch here. And I have the other half of him coming out in a winter scene. But I ended up not producing that cover because I did some cover tests with users and got better votes on different ones. And here's the other half of that drawing there too. Early days, he had a sock and he had a letter. So just machinations through the story. I felt like it was too far away from the Christmas paradigm for him to hold a sock instead of a bag. And now the Dear Santa letter is a candy cane because that's more in line with the final story. The next step is inks. So once you have the pencils, the inker will come across and ink it. And whether I did some of the inks or my artist, mainly the artist did most of the inks in this book. That's her full-time gig, is to ink and watercolor. I found her on Fiverr. I think she's been brilliant, and if you want a recommendation, let me know. But I do like Fiverr for that. Okay, so let me kind of show you some of the other inks. I'm going to go to a different spot here now. And right here. So inks. Give you an idea of how those evolved. And you can see the line quality gets really high. Some of the pages make it to the book, some of them don't. But here he is splashed in water. It's a pretty early drawing there, that where he's landing in funky spots. I can give feedback to the inker, and change things before we go into watercolors. And here he is walking in the playground, into the playground just when the story starts. I can also do color tests and stuff on inks, which is great. And then once we're ready and the inks are approved, then the next step is to go to colors. And in her case, my watercolorist is just absolutely genius. She is extremely talented. I'll give you an idea of some of the watercolor work that she did, like this, which is trying out different things to see what made this story work. And changing things. This was soap. I changed this soap into present at one time. You can still make changes along the way, it just gets more expensive as you go. So these are all digital watercolors. She puts in a watercolor paper behind the art and makes all the watercolors translucent so that it looks as if she's painting on traditional paper. Just absolutely gorgeous skills. And so that's, and you can see here the fiber highlights, because the way we worked was went back and forth, and until I actually approved it, it would give me watercolors, a watercolor on top of the watercolors in fiber. But this is just a great example of the rich color she's able to achieve digitally that I was not able to achieve on paper. Okay, and last but not least, one of my favorite parts is adding of the sparkles. So the Wormhole has magical sparkles that help to tell the story. And you see, if I just kind of toggle between these, this is a progression that I added where this was the original watercolors. I added the sparkles and sort of added more depth on the colors on the actual watercolor itself as I toggle back and forth. So the sparkles are all digitally added. And here we actually missed a candy cane. But you can see that adds a little extra something that it would have been hard to accomplish in watercolor, but has a really lovely experience for the book that's done digitally. So that's adding the sparkles. Okay, so the next step is once the sparkles are done, in sort of post-production, if you will, the next is adding in the layout and the letters. So this is just two of those pages that we've seen, and the text is just laid on. It's just, most people use something called InDesign, Adobe InDesign, but I happen to, or there's another one called Canva. But I happen to use Illustrator because that's just a tool of choice for me. And so you can see the placement is here. I put a little white halo around some of the images, and all these overlays of text are just text effects to help tell the story and carry your eye along through the page. And as I mentioned earlier in the script, I also added in highlights and bolds and colors to help make it easier for the reader to tell the story the way I would like it to be told, and to encourage them to have a bit of liveliness in their reading. Sorry, I went too far. So there's an example where it's kind of straightforward. There's some special effects sitting right here on top with those letters, and it helps with things like whoosh. You see, you sort of curve the text around to match the situation and make it more engaging. Okay, so that's laying in the text. The cover is developed the same way, just in a different file. And there is one other thing I want to share with you, is around iteration. So let's talk about that a minute. So that's all the mechanics. And you can iterate on your story from the script, which is the cheapest way to do it, all the way through art production. Just know that you're going to have to repay for pages if you do it in the art stages. And I iterate a lot. I paid a lot to do some iterations during the art stages. But what you're seeing here is a black foam core board, and it has all the pages that I had printed at that point. This is likely from the book after my first printing with Lulu.com. It's like a one-off printing. You can print one at a time for the user trials. And I got feedback from the readers, what they didn't understand, things that I didn't like, things that they thought could be changed or made shorter, or story problems. And so if I got feedback from an editor or director, it'd be like, hey, you're introducing the elves too late. It's not working. You got to do something about that. And so I'll give you an idea of what that looks like here. Let me go to here. Here's the actual board itself. Yes, after first trial run. Okay. So here's an example of the book. I'd already done one Christmas. This would have been Christmas 2020. And you can see the covers up there. And by then, the cover was still the actual letter, if you see that on his hand. I had some of the things in place, like Dusty the Reindeer, where he was starting out with his character arc. But things like the elves came in too late in the story. And so people were like, I don't know these elves. You're telling this stuff too late. I don't know what the elves are. I want them to be up front. So I added space. And then this was the story beat. Stanley sees the elves working on the wormhole. And they have to say it's still not stable. That's important. Not alliteration, but telling the details of your story in a fun way, how it works. You have to kind of squeeze that stuff in. And I want to make sure the elves are in the story throughout as well, because it's important. They're a big part of the story. And then let's see here. Here you can still see where Santa was facing forward, so I changed that. There's Stanley sitting on his shoulder. That's all changed now. Santa's actually not facing forward. He's pointing toward the wormhole. And there's other story beats in here. So we take that. What you can do is you can cut it into pieces, though, and fortunately children's books are easy. They're all essentially one beat, or maybe you have 2 pages as a spread, which is one beat, and you can put them right on a board like this with push pins, and you can move them around, and does the story feel right? And you can iterate pretty quickly to be sure that you're hitting your character arc. And if you're not really sure about that, you can look up something called the hero's journey, and it'll tell you about how you develop a character, their ups and downs, and their fail point just before they succeed, and all that kind of stuff. But this will give you an idea of what the process is for evolving the story. And one other little bit of insight before we're done here. The story did start out, as I mentioned earlier, with a couple of different changes than where it landed. The first is that Stanley was trying to help this little girl. It initially started out with him getting the gift that she was going to miss because she didn't have the letter to Santa, and it was a puppy for her brother who was dealing with cancer in the book. And then that evolved to her getting a little doll, one of the main doll characters in the story, to an older lady who had a nursing home, which was really sweet. And that one was right here. So we went through full production on that. There's the thumbnails and then the pencils. Actually, it's still thumbnails. And there he is in the background smiling because she's gotten this dolly over to this lady in the nursing home. And but the problem was the story was just so long, and I hadn't introduced the science elves, and there were some other problems with it. So eventually I pulled that out and changed it to the mechanic you have today. The other piece, which this was where it really hurt. I had him landing when he got sucked up by the wormhole in a candy factory. And so these are some of the pencils that I had when he was in the candy factory. But I just couldn't. The story was so long, I couldn't get it. I couldn't get it to stick. I had to make some choices. So he lands in here, and he actually is tempted to stay forever in the candy factory. It's fun. He gets candy. It's all these things he can do. And I'll show you. Here is where he makes his decision. There's a point where he's holding the dolly and he's thinking about the kids, and then he jumps into the wormhole and he goes on his adventure. But it was just too long of a story arc, and so I had to change it. Here's an example right there where he's like, why is this wormhole still here? I got the dolly. And he's like, oh my goodness, I forgot about the kids. So the choice of him to still save the gift for the kids was in there, but I moved it to before he jumps in the wormhole as opposed to when he accidentally lands in the candy factory. So the candy factory is actually not in the story, except if I ever am lucky enough to have a movie, I might very well go in to the story and tweak it just a bit. And I'll show you how I kept this story beat in there. These are the final pages here, and I'll see if I can find the one where the wormhole, or the elves are actually looking at the wormhole and they see Stanley. In that little spot, I still leave a little bit of the, where's that guy? Here it is right there. They're looking at the wobble meter. You can see Stanley right there inside the candy factory. So it's in there, and I may very well use it one day if I have a larger amount of time, like a film, to tell that story. But that's essentially how it evolved, and these days he doesn't get the gift for a little girl to give to someone in a nursing home. He just saves all the gifts and gets them where they need to be in time for Christmas. And that keeps the story page count down to 32 pages, which is pretty critical for printing and also for parents who are super busy. And that's it. That's sort of the story. That's where it all ends, is with him, basically saving Christmas after accidentally triggering a wormhole. Thank you for your time.